Hello, and welcome to the second lecture for topic one. And in this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at the key features of democracy. So let's get started. Just because you call yourself a democracy doesn't make yourself a democracy. And North Korea is a good example of that. The formal name of North Korea is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And as we know, Korea is far from a democracy. Its people don't have any say, and the government knows no limits on its power. And this is kind of a picture that sort of that illustrates that the people maybe don't feel super comfortable around their leaders. This is just a family being visited by the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong Un, and off to the side is a military advisor who's there to sort of like oversee the meeting. And you just look at the pictures of the looks on the people's face in the picture, and they look like either they're forcing smiles or grimacing, trying to seem happy, but mostly they just seem like they're in fear, not necessarily the looks of that would be on the faces of people who live in a democracy. So just because you call yourself a democracy doesn't make yourself a democracy. In fact, there have to be key components present for a country to be considered a democracy, and North Korea is far from that. Now, in our previous lecture, we talked about how a democracy is rule of the people, but it's translated into popular sovereignty. That is that political authority ultimately rests in the hands of the people. But there are other factors that need to be in place for a country to really thrive as a democracy. So in this lecture, we're going to take a look at what those factors are. That in order for the people to be sovereign, to have that ultimate authority, those people need to be knowledgeable, and they also need to participate within their democratic society. And so we're going to be talking about that one component that you need for democracy is that you need a knowledgeable and active citizenry. We're also going to be talking about the concept of political efficacy, that democracies, the people who live in democracies, have to feel as if their voices are being heard. They also have to have a specific level of trust in government in order to want to participate in that democratic society. And then democracies need to be responsive to the will of the people. If the political authority ultimately rests in the hands of the people, but democracy doesn't listen to what the people want, then it's really not fully democratic. So let's dig into each of these three elements in a little bit more detail. The first factor that we're going to be talking about is political knowledge. And your textbook defines political knowledge as a person possessing information about the formal institutions of government, political actors, and political issues. Now, something you want to keep in mind is that political knowledge is more than an opinion or a strongly held viewpoint. A political knowledge is actually based on facts. It's not based on your opinion. And so that if I asked you a question about a political actor, if I asked you who is the vice president of the United States, there's a right answer to that. The vice president of the United States is Kamala Harris. If you said Mike Pence, you would be wrong. He was the previous vice president in the United States. Now, your political viewpoint or opinion might be that Mike Pence is a better vice president than Kamala Harris, but that's not a measure of one's political knowledge. Now, it's important that democracies have a citizenry that has a relatively high level of political knowledge. Why? Well, since democracy is rule of the people, you want the people to be informed about their political institutions, actors, and issues, so that when they're engaging in politics, supporting a candidate, voting for a candidate, campaigning for a candidate, rallying for a particular issue, that their actions are actually based upon facts, not just on opinions. So what is level of the level of political knowledge in the United States? Do we have a very knowledgeable citizenry, or is there some room for improvement? Well, the first thing that we're going to do is I want you to test your political knowledge. Okay. Now, I know you're taking this class because you want to learn more. I've read through a lot of your questionnaires, and students are like, I'm taking this class because I want more political knowledge. But it's sometimes fun to take quizzes about what you know so that you know what you don't know so that you can improve moving forward. So let's take a look at some questions. Hey, here's your opportunity to test your own political knowledge. These are common kinds of questions that might appear on a political knowledge survey, which they actually take those in the United States. So, hey, can you name the 3 branches of the federal government? Take a second. You can pause the video, write it down. What is the Bill of Rights? I kind of give you a hint on that because we talked about that in the last lecture. But before the last lecture, if I asked you what the Bill of Rights is, would you know? How about this one? There are 5 liberties listed in the First Amendment. What are they? Can you name any of them? How many judges are on the Supreme Court of the United States? And bonus, can you name any of the Supreme Court justices? All right, let's look at the answers on the next slide. Okay, and here are the answers to those questions I just asked. Testing yourself and quizzing yourself is a really good way of just learning political knowledge. Every week, well, I'm kind of a nerd, but every week the New York Times has a news quiz, right, to see how closely that you follow the news that week. And I always take it, and I always get pissed off if I, get answers wrong because I'm a perfectionist. I want to be right on everything. But I'll tell you, getting stuff wrong is really good because then they tell you what the answer is. And so it's like, ooh, I learned something. And so let's see if you learned anything here. So what are the 3 branches of government? Well, you'll know this by the end of the semester, like the back of your hand. The legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. We actually kind of talked about that in the first lecture. What is the Bill of Rights? Y'all know that. It's the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. And when we get to our section on civil liberties, we're going to be talking about all of the liberties that are enumerated in the Bill of Rights. I also teach a civil liberties class in the spring. So if you take that, if you really dig that section on civil liberties in this class, you might want to consider taking that in the spring because it digs in more deeply in civil liberties. Hey, there are 5 liberties that are listed in the First Amendment. What are they? Well, most Americans can only name 1, but these are the 5. Speech, religion, press, freedom to assemble, and the freedom to petition the government for a redress of grievance. Basically, if something's going wrong, you have a right to ask the government to, address these concerns that you have. And so there are 5. Hey, how many did you get? I'd be happy if you got 1, but hopefully by the end of the semester, you'll remember all 5. How many judges are on the Supreme Court? Do you know? The answer is 9. But hint, it's actually not in the Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution does it tell us how many Supreme Court justices we're supposed to have. That's actually established by congressional law. And so it's wavered from 5. I think it's gone up to as much as 10 or 11, but today it is 9. And it's been 9 since the middle of the 1800s. Bonus points. Can you name any Supreme Court justice? Since Ruth Bader Ginsburg was kind of like a popular icon. She showed up, on Saturday Night Live. Catherine McKinnon would, do like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Could have named her, but as we know, she died about a year ago. So here you go, in order of seniority. So Chief Justice Roberts, and then he actually hasn't been on the court the longest, but the Chief Justice has the most seniority. And then Justice Thomas, Breyer, Alito, Sonia Sotomayor, Kagan, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and the justice that replaced Bader Ginsburg is Amy Coney Barrett. She's the newest and least senior of the judges. So did you get any of those right? Just a test of your knowledge. Okay, so in your textbook, it has a graph about what Americans know about government, and this is based on the Annenberg Constitution Day Civics survey from 2016 and also 2017. And it paints somewhat of a, I wouldn't say dismal picture, but it's, it shows that we have some room for improvement when it comes to political knowledge. At this time, only 26% of people could identify all 3 branches of government. About half the people, a little bit more than half of the people, know that Congress has the power to declare war, not the President of the United States. I'll let you read over these in our, in your textbook, but, asking, can you name any of the rights that are guaranteed in the First Amendment, even just one like speech, 37% at this time couldn't name any. So if you looked at that and you asked, how are we doing? I think that it would be reasonable to conclude to say, like, when it comes to political knowledge, there's some room for improvement. Most recently, we have seen some improvements when it comes to political knowledge in the United States. Every year, the Annenberg School of Public Policy does the Constitution Day Civics Survey that surveys, over 1,000 people to get in the United States. And when we learn about survey research, you'll realize that that's actually a pretty big number to get a sense of what political knowledge is. And in 2020, we saw an improvement, and the new one will be coming out in a few weeks. And so we'll see if there's an even greater improvement over that. And so when it comes to knowledge of individual rights, we've seen some pretty good improvement. That the percentage of Americans who could not name any First Amendment rights fell from 37%, we just looked at that in 2017, to 19%. So we see that people are more aware of the liberties that they have in the First Amendment. So that's a good improvement. And we also saw an improvement in a person's ability to identify all three branches of government. 51% named all three branches of the federal government, up from 39% in 2019. So that's a pretty remarkable jump in just 1 year. And so indicating that maybe political knowledge is getting a little bit better in the United States. We did see some declines in political knowledge in the latest Annenberg survey. And they had to do with the powers of Congress and also the powers of the Supreme Court. That when it comes to, and as you'll learn in this class, that when Congress passes a law, the president can veto a law, but that Congress can override that veto with 2/3 of a vote, right? So a supermajority. And that went down pretty significantly in the latest survey. That less than half, or 47% of Americans, did not know that you needed a 2/3 majority to override a presidential veto. There was also a significant decline when it came to understanding the powers of the Supreme Court. In that area, that when it comes to the Supreme Court, only about 50% of Americans realized that the Supreme Court had the final say on the constitutionality of law and the constitutionality and the actions of the executive branch. And so we saw a little bit of a decline there as well. So we still have, some room for improvement. Nearly half of Americans can't name all three branches of government. Nearly 1 in 5 can't name one liberty in the First Amendment, even though that we are getting stronger and better on that. And so let's take a look at some critical thinking questions as it relates to the political knowledge piece. So what do you think? What do you think is the potential cause for the increase in political knowledge from 2017 to 2020? And do you think this is a trend? I mean, do you think this is indicating a longer trend in terms of people in the United States becoming more politically knowledgeable? Do you think that Americans will continue to improve political knowledge, or is this increase in political knowledge a response to a specific circumstance? The Annenberg School of Public Policy, they sort of hypothesized that this increase in knowledge is due to sort of the political divisions and contentions that took place during the Trump administration from 2017 to 2021. A lot more people reported saying that they used to not pay attention to politics, but now they're paying attention to politics. And so the Annenberg School felt that that was maybe a reason for that uptick. It remains to be seen whether or not this is something that will continue. Also, that while we're making improvements, we nearly half can't name the three branches. Nearly 60% of people don't even know that press freedoms is in the First Amendment, etc. Is it a cause for concern, right? Even though we're making improvements, are Americans not knowledgeable about politics, and is that a cause for concern? if you're not knowledgeable about politics, are you concerned about that? I mean, you can always look it up on the internet what the three branches of government are or who the vice president is. Can you have a low level of political, like fact-based knowledge, but still be a vibrant and involved and making a meaningful contribution to our democratic society? So just some things to think about. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is political efficacy. And your textbook defines political efficacy is the belief that you can influence what government does. Keep in mind, political efficacy is a belief that a person has. It's not that they actually do make a difference or that they don't make a difference, but they believe that their actions can make a political difference. So here's two examples. That if you believe that writing a letter to your member of Congress, which we're actually going to do in this class, makes a difference, that you could persuade a lawmaker to listen to your viewpoint, take what you're saying into consideration, and actually use that when deciding how to vote on a law, that means that you would have a high level of political efficacy. If you feel like it's a waste of effing time, it's just like, why bother because they ain't going to listen to you anyways, then you have a low sense of political efficacy. If you feel like attending a rally raises awareness and can make change. So if any of you attended a Black Lives Matter rally after the death of George Floyd, and you did that because you felt like it could make a difference, that people were going to listen and change was going to come out of that, then you have a higher sense of political efficacy. But if you didn't attend because you thought it was a waste of time, then you would have a low level of political efficacy. It will come as no surprise to you, and we'll take a look at some slides in a second. Political efficacy in the United States is low. People don't believe that their voices are listened to by their political leaders. People don't believe that their actions make a difference, okay? However, keep in mind that there's a relationship between education and efficacy. The more educated people are, particularly college-educated people, the more likely they are to believe that their voices are listened to. So you might want to ask yourself why that is. What could contribute to the correlation between having a higher level of education and having a high level of efficacy, or vice versa? Why, if you're not very well educated, you might feel like your voice doesn't make a difference. It could be that if you're higher educated, you have more money, and so you have more money to donate to a campaign, and you might think that money matters, right? But if you're lower educated, you might not have as much money. You might not feel like you have the money to donate, and so maybe that's what you think is the only thing that matters. It could also be that as you're more educated, you just have a better understanding of how government works, right? That you realize it's complicated, that it's slow moving, but that raising awareness and being involved over the long term can really make a difference. You might know historic examples of that taking place, like the civil rights marches in the 1950s and 60s. And so just there's some things to think about what that relationship is between education and efficacy. Now let's take a look at measures of efficacy in the United States. So this is a survey data from the Pew Research Center about asking questions about how people feel about their elected officials. And so on the one hand, that they would ask people, do you feel like elected officials lose touch with people quickly, or do you feel like they try to stay in touch with voters? 77% of people said, nope, they lose touch with people quickly. They don't care about what people like me think. They put their own interest first, right? And, a much smaller percentage of people on the other side of the graph feel that, like elected officials really care about us and care about our interests and not just their own interests. So that, sort of shows this low sense of efficacy, that elected officials really don't care about people like me. Now, this graph, also from the Pew Research Center, shows changes in the question about, do elected officials care about people like me, care about people, what I think? It looks at changes over time from 1994 to 2015. And I think we see some pretty interesting things here. We definitely see that, in 1994, that 64% of people said that they didn't think that elected officials care about what people like me think. But then we see that kind of, efficacy kind of people start having an increased sense of, hey, wait, government does care about what people like me think. And in 2000, it goes as high as 39%. But we see this a widening gap, between an increased level of lack of efficacy in the United States here, with 74% of people saying that government doesn't care about what people like me think about, right? So maybe think about what might be contributing to that, like what happened in 2000 to feel like, hey, they are listening to me. The economy was really good in 2000 under the Clinton administration. We really saw a vibrant sort of economy. So maybe when the economy is good, people are like, hell yeah, government's listening to me. But that we've had good economic times at other points within our history since then. But we see sort of just a downward or an increase in lack of efficacy. We also have increased polarization, and studies have also showed that not only do we not trust our elected officials, but we don't trust the people who live around us either. So it could just sort of be a reflection of, I don't know, social media and those information bubbles and growing polarization as well. Another way to think about political efficacy is to ask people whether they trust their government. And the Pew Research Center every year does a survey that asks people, do you trust the government in Washington to do what is right always, most of the time, sometimes, rarely, or never? And what this graph shows is those people who said that they trust the government to do what is right always or most of the time. And this basically shows a trend over time from the 1950s with President Eisenhower all the way through Trump. And you can see that the general trend line is downwards to the point where only about 20% of people in the United States say that they trust the government to do what is right almost all the time or always, okay? Most of the time or always. And so we have a decline there. And so, again, this is another way to sort of demonstrate that we have a low level of political efficacy because we don't really trust government. We do see a little bit of an uptake, interestingly, around 2001. And here we are at the 20-year anniversary, not the right word, but the commemoration of 9/11. And, you really actually saw trust in government to go up during that time period. And a lot of political scientists think that's because when we are faced with a great threat to our nation, that we kind of rally together and we want to trust government to do what is right. So we see that reflected there, but that was relatively short-lived. And so here are some critical thinking questions for you to take a look at. And I oftentimes sprinkle in some critical thinking questions because when we get to our midterm exam and our final exam, I oftentimes ask at least one of the prompts in the questions that you'll be answering in your essay take-home tests will be sort of a critical thinking question prompt. And it's oftentimes a reflection of what ends up in lectures. So what do you think? Which is more concerning, lack of political knowledge or low levels of trust and efficacy? If you had to pick between the two, would you rather live in a democracy where people had low levels of political knowledge, or would you rather live in a democracy where people have low levels of trust and don't feel like their voice makes a difference? And so think about that. Which would be easier to remedy too? Let's say you had people who had a high level of efficacy but a low level of knowledge. Would it be easier to remedy that, or vice versa? And maybe you can think about how those intersect as well. We did see that if you have a higher level of education, you have a higher level of efficacy. And so something to think about. Think about what impact does low political efficacy and lack of trust in government have on maintaining a democratic society? Is it easier, and why is it easier to maintain a democratic society when people have a higher level of trust and have a higher level of knowledge? Or is having not a lot of trust in your government, is that a healthy thing for a democracy? Okay, something to think about. And so do you think that is democracy threatened by low trust and low efficacy as another way of thinking about that question? The last factor that we're going to talk about is that in a democracy, government needs to be responsive to the will of the people. So what does that mean? Well, first, that in a democracy, we have to be able to have a good mechanism for determining what the people want. What is the will of the people? There's two main ways that we do that in a democracy. One is, particularly in a representative democracy like in the United States, how we know what the people want is often the product of elections. So we want to make sure that when we have elections, that they truly reflect what the people want. And that to truly reflect what the people want, we want to make sure that those elections are free and fair. In other words, we want to make sure that anybody who's meets the requirements to vote can vote without feeling that they are going to be hassled when they get to their voting place, or that there's going to be some sort of retribution if they, vote in a way that the government somehow knows how they vote, and there's going to be some sort of repercussion for that. And that does take place in non-democratic governments, but not in a democracy. You also want to feel, there to not be so many constraints placed on voting that people are just feel like there's too many hoops you have to jump through in order to vote. So you want to make sure that voting is accessible so that we get a true sense of what the will of the people is. On the flip side of that, you want to make sure that elections are fair, right? You want to make sure that all the ballots are counted, that there's an accurate count of the ballots. And you also want to make sure that only the people that are supposed to be voting meet the requirements are voting. And so there's this sort of balance to make sure that our elections are free from fraud, but we don't want to make sure that there's so many restraints that are put in place to make sure that our elections are actually fair, that we don't get a sense of what the will of the people want because those restraints are preventing people from showing up to the ballot box. We also want to make sure that people have an opportunity to express themselves. One way of knowing the will of the people is at the ballot box, but another way for government to know and be responsive to the will of the people is for people to have an opportunity to freely express themselves without feeling that they're going to get in trouble for doing that. And so freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, because the press needs to feel free that they can actually report on the activities of government without getting in trouble. And also you want to make sure that people in a democracy feel like they can, freely associate with others, join political parties, join interest groups so that their will can be expressed and hopefully responded to by the government. Another thing to keep in mind is that in a democracy, you want to make sure that when we talk about the will of the people, that we're talking about all the people, not some of the people. And what that basically means is that in a democracy, we have to have pluralism. And pluralism means that all interests have the right to compete for the influence of government. And so when it comes to knowing what the people want, we really have to let people freely participate in the exchange of ideas. And so that we should allow all kinds of political parties, that we should allow for all kinds of political expression. And that the thinking is that these different ideas will compete in the marketplace of ideas or compete in the political marketplace of elections. And that people will say, you know what, those ideas are good. I'm going to align myself with them. I've listened to these ideas and they're filled with errors and bad ideas, so we're going to reject those ideas. And so that pluralism is about letting that competition take place, and that whoever presents the best ideas and the candidates has an opportunity to win elections and therefore influence government and have government be responsive to you. It is important that if your viewpoint wins the election or wins out in the marketplace of ideas, that the winning group sort of takes an attitude of compromise and moderation. Yes, your candidate might have won or your political party might have won, but for democracies to work, we also have to make sure that they take into perspective the other viewpoints of those groups that didn't win. And then finally, that in a democracy, for the government to be responsive to the people, that we do need to say that the majority rules, right, that whatever the most people want hopefully government will be responsive to that. But there's sometimes when what the majority wants can be detrimental to those who are not in the majority. So in a democracy, you also want to make sure that there's majority rule, but with limits. That the rights of those in the minority must be protected, because if it's the will of the people, and if what the people want is anti-democratic, right, does not respect the ability of other people to live freely, right, then there's something concerning about that. And so all of these are aspects that we should keep in mind in terms of what makes for a truly thriving democracy. As we've seen throughout the course of this lecture, that labeling your country a democracy is easy, but creating and maintaining a democracy is much more difficult. And there are key components that really need to be in place and to be nurtured in order for a democracy to survive. It takes participation, work, and dedication to the democratic experiment to keep a democracy thriving. And this is just, sort of the first lecture that outlines some of these key factors that we're going to be taking a look at over the course of the semester. Next week, we will be looking at the documents and the values that are at the foundation for this democratic experiment as we examine the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and the Bill of Rights. All right, thanks a lot for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.